Hello, everyone. Today we're going to break down one of the most disturbing parts of Insidious. Out of the further, the opening scene. The movie doesn't begin with Gemma as the adult mother we follow through most of the story. Instead, it takes us back to 1999, when Gemma is still a young girl living with her mother, Ingrid. And what happens in those first few minutes is extremely important because the opening isn't just there to scare us. It actually explains the trauma that controls Gemma's entire life and quietly sets up the supernatural mystery that comes later. Before we continue, here's your spoiler alert. We're going to discuss the opening scene, what happens to Gemma's mother, and how that moment connects to the further and the rest of the movie. So, what really happened? At the beginning of the movie, young Gemma comes home from school to a house that already feels completely wrong. Her mother, Ingrid, isn't acting like a normal parent. She's distant, exhausted, and barely seems aware of what's happening around her. Gemma has clearly become used to taking care of herself because Ingrid spends much of her time sleeping or behaving strangely. At first, it looks like the movie is showing us a child dealing with a deeply troubled mother. And that's exactly how Gemma understands it. She doesn't know anything about the further. She doesn't know about demons. And she certainly doesn't understand that her mother may be dealing with something supernatural. Then the night takes a terrifying turn. Gemma hears strange noises downstairs. She gets out of bed and starts looking for her mother. Eventually, she finds Ingrid in the kitchen holding a knife. Ingrid looks terrified and confused. But instead of attacking Gemma, she suddenly runs away. Gemma follows her toward the bathroom, not understanding what is happening. Then Ingrid looks directly at her daughter. And she says something that makes the entire moment even more disturbing. She tells Gemma, "Watch me." What happens next becomes one of the most traumatic memories of Gemma's childhood. Ingrid begins violently smashing her own head against the wall. Gemma is completely frozen. She doesn't understand why her mother is doing this. She can't stop it. And eventually, Ingrid dies. The blood begins spreading underneath the bathroom door, while young Gemma is left standing there in shock. On the surface, it looks like a horrifying story about a mother suffering from severe mental illness. And for years, that's essentially how Gemma remembers it. She believes her mother was unstable. She believes Ingrid's behavior was something psychological. And most importantly, she believes that the tragedy was something that simply happened to her family. But the movie later reveals that Gemma's understanding of that night was incomplete. There was something else happening. Ingrid wasn't simply losing control. She was connected to the further. And she had an ability that Gemma would eventually inherit. She was a courier.
That means she had a special connection to the further and could interact with that realm in ways that ordinary people couldn't. This revelation completely changes the meaning of the opening scene. When we watch Ingrid acting strangely, we're not simply watching someone having a breakdown. We're watching someone who is being targeted by a supernatural force. And that force is connected to Cyrus. Cyrus is the dead cult leader at the center of the movie's supernatural threat. He wants access to the living world, and he needs someone with the right abilities to help him cross that boundary. Ingrid realizes what Cyrus is trying to do, and she understands that if she allows him to use her connection to the further, he could use her as a doorway into the world of the living. So Ingrid makes an extreme decision. She chooses to die rather than allow Cyrus to use her. That's why the opening scene becomes so much more tragic once we know the truth. Young Gemma thinks her mother is simply destroying herself, but Ingrid is actually trying to protect her daughter. She knows that if she remains alive and under Cyrus's influence, Gemma could eventually become his next target. And that's exactly what happens years later. Gemma grows up, she becomes a mother herself, and she moves back into the same house where she experienced the worst moment of her childhood. That decision is important. Gemma isn't returning because she wants to relive the trauma. She's trying to take control of it. She wants to give her daughter Maya the happy childhood she never had. But the house still carries the memory of what happened. And more importantly, Gemma's connection to the further has never completely disappeared. As the movie progresses, her supernatural experiences become harder to ignore. She begins having strange dreams. She enters impossible spaces. She encounters entities that shouldn't be able to reach the living world. And eventually, she discovers the truth about her mother. That's when the opening scene is completely recontextualized. The woman Gemma remembered as distant and unstable was actually fighting something she couldn't explain. Ingrid wasn't simply abandoning her daughter, she was trying to protect her. And that's one of the movie's biggest emotional ideas. Gemma has spent years believing that her mother failed her. But when she enters the further and finally confronts Ingrid's spirit, she learns that the truth was much more complicated. Her mother had been fighting the same supernatural threat that eventually comes after Gemma. And Ingrid's final act was an attempt to break that connection. The tragedy is that young Gemma couldn't possibly understand any of this. All she saw was her mother dying. She didn't see the supernatural battle happening behind it. She didn't know about Cyrus, she didn't know about the further, and she didn't know that her mother was making a terrible sacrifice to protect her. That's why the opening scene is so important. It isn't just a flashback, it's the foundation of the entire story. It explains Gemma's fear, her relationship with her mother, her connection to the further, and ultimately why Cyrus becomes interested in her. And there's an even deeper connection. Gemma now has a daughter of her own, Maya. That means Gemma is facing the same cycle that once trapped her mother. Ingrid had to protect Gemma. Now Gemma has to protect Maya. But unlike Ingrid, Gemma has a chance to understand what's actually happening. She knows the further exists. So when you look back at the opening scene after watching the entire movie, it feels completely different. At first, it looks like the story of a disturbed mother and a frightened child. By the end, we understand that it was actually the beginning of a supernatural family legacy. Ingrid was a courier. Gemma inherited that ability, and Maya appears to have inherited it as well. The opening scene therefore establishes the movie's central question long before we even understand what that question is. Can Gemma break the cycle that began with her mother? And can she protect Maya from the same darkness? That's what really happened in the opening scene of Insidious, Out of the Further. Ingrid's death wasn't simply a random tragedy. It was connected to Cyrus, the further, and the supernatural ability passed through her family. And the heartbreaking part is that young Gemma had no way of knowing that her mother was trying to save her. She only knew that something terrible had happened. Years later, Gemma finally learns the truth, and that knowledge becomes the key to defeating the threat that destroyed her childhood. So the next time you watch the opening of Out of the Further, pay attention to Ingrid, because what initially looks like the beginning of Gemma's trauma is actually the beginning of the entire supernatural story. And once you know what really happened, that opening scene becomes much more tragic than frightening.